Okay, good morning, everybody. Again, for everybody who's joining on, I am Dawn Muscanera. I am the social worker here at Willets Road School. So excited to be meeting all of you and to, be working with your children and the team at Willets here this year. And I am so happy to present Michael, who comes to us from Newport Healthcare and who is a licensed clinical social worker. He has so much knowledge, so much. I have attended many of his workshops, and I have always learned a ton. So I thought we would share him with everybody here in East Williston. So, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dawn and Christine, for having me today. And Dawn, thank you very much for the kind words. This is a presentation on the tech and social media use that I've done quite a lot. Over the past, I would say probably the past 8 years is when I started doing this. And every single year, even multiple times during the year, it's transitioned. It's completely changed as time goes on, just because I think, as we all know, tech is always changing. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that I learned for this presentation, I actually learned from your children, students like your children, where, I'm doing the presentation. They're like, whoa, Michael, wait a second. Facebook is obsolete. No one uses Facebook anymore. So, I start removing some things and adding other things, just kind of with the different trends. But really the presentation, before I jump into it, initially was geared to the addictive qualities of technology and social media, what draws us to it. And parents were kind of saying, this is great. We're learning a lot about the addictive nature and the addictive qualities of this stuff, but we're still kind of lost. Like, what do we do? Yes, we understand why our children are struggling with this, why they're using it excessively, but how do we start pulling back and developing a little bit more of a balance, which is the key word, which we'll talk about today. So that's what I've added. The first half of this presentation that I'll touch on is a little bit more about social media tech and what drives us to it. And then the second half is more so what we can do to hopefully develop a little bit more balance in our own lives and obviously with our children as well. So Dawn, if I click the present now, I'll share a screen. Beautiful. Okay. It's saying can't share your screen. Let me see.
Michael, is your presentation a Google slide that you could share us on, and one of us could share it, or is it?
It's Microsoft PowerPoint. Am I able to send that to you and you could pull it up? Then maybe I'll just do that just to make it easier. Yes. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to forward that your way. Bear with me for 1 second, everybody. Dawn, what's your email?
But it's very long. MUSCARNERD@ewsdmail.org.
Perfect. Thank you.
Further screen. It's saying you have access to share.
Yeah, it might be a setting on my end. Perhaps okay. I'll try it one more time, but it might be a setting on my end. Let me try. Yeah, it's not letting me. I'm just going to send it your way, Dawn, just for time reasons.
Maybe we should ask one of the students.
Yeah, give them a buzz. All right, Dawn, it's heading your way.
It's not to me yet.
Michael, can you start? Maybe if you can see it on your computer, you can just start talking, and then Dawn and I will get it up.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Okay. Pull it up. Okay. So, and you guys could still see me, right? Whoop. Can you all see me on your end?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. I pulled up the PowerPoint. I don't know if you lost me. Okay, so again, what I'm going to be speaking on today are overall the impacts of excessive social media and technology use, and more importantly, what we can do about it. So, a lot of times we talk about social media. I mean, of course, we know the pretty common ones: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat are huge now with the adolescents. Over time, as I've been doing this presentation, like I said, I've started to incorporate things like YouTube and video games, just because video games are a lot different now than they were when we were children. I remember my first console was Sega Genesis, and it was one of those things where if you were playing with somebody, it was because they were literally either sitting on your left or your right side. Whereas now, video games, we have the ability to play with multiple people, but sometimes up to 100 different people from all over the globe. So it was one of those things that no longer was solely just video games and entertainment. It was now a way to truly converse and meet people from all across the globe. And obviously that could be a positive thing, being able to meet so many different people. But I think when we're talking about adolescents and children, that could also obviously be a little bit of a scary thing. I've heard a lot of horror stories of individuals that are 8, 9, 10 years old playing in game rooms with people that are 30, 40 years old. And obviously, sometimes the conversation can be very colorful and probably not something that an 8, 9, 10-year-old should really be hearing. So that was another thing that I added to this presentation, because the gaming has been a real big thing that's been popping up. The other thing that I added, and I'm very curious, and if anybody wants to be a brave soul and kind of throw their answer out there, if anybody's heard of Finsta, and if anybody wants to take a stab at what they think Finsta is. And if you don't, that's totally cool. Usually the response I get, not many people do know about it.
Is that when students are, or kids, people are making fake Instagram accounts and posing as someone else?
Spot on. Exactly, Raquel. So that's exactly what it is. Basically, it's short for fake Instagram account. So what I've learned, just and this I came across this about 4 or 5 years ago, was when I was first brought into this, and the individual kind of described it as your ability to kind of create an Instagram account that's a little bit more anonymous, being able to kind of post things that maybe you wouldn't want everybody to see, you'd want your close group of friends to see. And part of me was kind of like, okay, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I mean, maybe I don't want to post something for the masses to see, but my close group of friends, that's better, so that's kind of my quote unquote Finsta account. But I've also heard how this can be used a little bit more maliciously, unfortunately, where somebody is potentially bullying somebody, over the internet or whatever. And now they're able to do it with a little bit of a shield, in a sense, where it is a little bit more anonymous, where it's not as easily tied back to them. So Finsta was something that I was introduced to. And like I said, I saw how it could be used potentially as a positive, and also like anything, how it can also have negative impacts as well. So right off the bat, I like to touch on definitely some of the positives about social media and tech. I mean, we've been having this conversation for a while, and a lot of times it's more on the gloom and doom of tech and social media. So I like to just touch on some of the positives real quick, as I'm sure we're already familiar. Especially over the past year and a half, we've seen how it has allowed us to stay connected, the ability to continue working and receive an education. I mean, for a while there, some of you joined us a little later, than some of the beginning, but we were talking a little bit about transition with school, going from a hybrid model to now fully in person. And for a bit there, we were solely virtual. It was solely remote for some of these students, and we really were able to kind of move without really any blip in the radar. Making sure that our children and our students are still getting an education. So technology definitely played a huge role in that. It's a form of entertainment when things weren't going on. So during the pandemic, again, we weren't able to necessarily leave our homes. We weren't able to go outside and spend time with friends where we would have in the past. So video games and YouTube and movies and different things like that acted as a real great, option for entertainment when a time of going out was an old thing. And treatment for those in need didn't skip a beat as well. So, my role with Newport is obviously helping families get into treatment. I do a little private practice myself. And one of the things that we saw was obviously people were not comfortable physically coming to offices on both sides. Therapists weren't comfortable seeing clients, and clients weren't comfortable going to their therapist's office. And then it got to the point where it wasn't even an option. So tech and social media allowed us to kind of continue those types of treatments without really skipping a beat for a very vulnerable population. So like I said, I like to really touch on the fact that there's a lot of positives that come with, but the the majority of this presentation and conversation will be more on the negative effects. So right off the bat, and by the way, Dawn, cut me off if you pull up the presentation. I'll stop sharing on my end and go to you. But one of the things that I like to highlight right from the get-go, and I kind of mentioned this slide in the beginning and at the end, is no screen time is created equal. Different uses will lead to different effects. And I think that's a huge, huge important thing to kind of keep in the back of our mind. A lot of times when we have the conversation about social media and tech with parents and caregivers, whoever, usually the first concern is my child spends way too much time on the games. My child spends way too much time on their phone. And in the beginning, when social media and tech was a newer thing, or at least the smart technology was a newer thing, going back to like the mid 2000s, that's kind of how we rated it. If you're on video games for 10 hours a day, that's an issue. Now what they view it as is less so the amount of time that you're using something and more so what you're taking in during that time. So you could turn around and say, if I'm on tech for 5 hours a day, you could very easily turn around and say, whoa, you got to pull that back because 5 hours is too much. But if you break it down to 2 hours of that 5 is doing schoolwork, 1 hour is entertainment by playing games, and then the other 2 hours is doing research, whatever, making it up. That's a much different use of time than 5 hours of solely playing video games. So what I would challenge you to kind of do as far as changing your mindset is less on the amount of time that our loved one is using tech and more so on what they're taking in when they're using it, because like I said, different uses will lead to different effects. So some of the negative impacts.
Michael,
yes.
I'm just joining. Do you see it's up? We're up to the negative impacts. We have this.
Oh, beautiful. There you go.
Okay.
There you go. And Dawn, if you wouldn't mind, I'll let you know when to forward to the next one if you'd be so kind. But some of the negative impacts. So what we find, and a lot of this conversation, just so you know, and a lot of this is relatable to adults as well, of course, but I'm going to kind of focus more so on the adolescent and child population. What we find with children and adolescents is those that spend excessive time or do most of their socializing through a screen start to struggle having face-to-face conversations or start to lose some of those skills. So I generally try and equate this to somebody who goes to the gym. So if I'm going to the gym every single day and running 5 miles, the next day when I go to run 5 miles, it's probably going to be pretty easy. It's going to be pretty effortless because I do have that stamina, that muscle memory. But if I go to the gym once a month and run 5 miles, the next time I go, it's going to be that much harder. And these are things that start to suffer over time. So again, if I'm used to solely conversing with people via text, talking to somebody in person might be really, really awkward and really difficult, because the difference between talking to somebody in person versus through a computer screen is the phone screen to the computer screen gives you the opportunity to really kind of think about what you want to say and potentially avoid an uncomfortable situation, versus when you're in front of somebody, you're kind of expected to give somewhat of a response. You can't just stand there and stare at somebody, because that would probably be a little inappropriate. You're looking for some kind of a response. And for people that struggle socially to begin with, being put on the spot like that is, something that they do start to really struggle with. The other thing that we see is a lot of times individuals that use screens excessively start to struggle with things as simple as eye contact. And some of us might struggle with that. I know me personally, like making constant eye contact with somebody, at some point it gets really uncomfortable because it's very intimate. When you're looking at somebody in the eyes, you are solely focused on them. So naturally, as human beings, we do try and break that every once in a while. We'll look at the wall, we'll look up, we'll look down. And again, that's something that just is natural, as human beings. But for children and adolescents who spend a ton of time on their screens, that's something that comes even harder for them. Having a way to avoid and work around poor social skills. So individuals that struggle socially and would rather not leave the house, they're kind of given an awesome opportunity not to have to leave the house, especially over the past year and a half. They've been able to do schooling over the computer. They've been able to kind of, entertain themselves over the computer. So really, back in the day when you could turn around and say, shut the video games off, go outside and play with your friends, there was more incentive because you didn't have that connection if you weren't going out there with people. Now you very realistically have that connection. And some of you might have even experienced this yourself. I know I'm working with a young gentleman in my private practice right now where his group of friends are scattered across the globe. Like he'll turn to me and say, my sleep is totally off because the people I talk to are in England. And again, this is a bigger conversation because you could probably turn around and say, whoa, somebody in New York, an adolescent talking to people all around the world. I mean, that might be a little bit concerning for a parent. But, the point I'm trying to make is, there's less incentive for him to sign off because his friend group are solely accessible through the internet. we are finding, and this, a lot of these bullets on here are probably commonsensical. I think a lot of you probably already are looking at this and saying, we already know this, but definitely a lot of research and data with regards to excessive social media and tech use leading to increased episodes of anxiety, decreased life satisfaction in the comparison games. Instagram is notorious for this, where people will kind of just continue to scroll through things and kind of compare their life to somebody else, leading to issues with regards to body dysmorphia. And there's actually something called Snapchat dysmorphia, if you aren't familiar. And more on top of that, in people's desire to solely take pictures with filters now. It's becoming an archaic thing where we're actually just taking just a generic plain picture without any doctoring it up. And now Snapchat and different platforms like that allow us to kind of find a perfect filter, fix our complexion, fix our whatever. And the problem with that, what we run into is it's unrealistic to kind of keep that going. It's unsustainable. At some point when we leave the house, people are going to see our true colors, our true features, whatever it might be. So we can't stay hidden behind these filters. There's actually apps on top of Snapchat and other things like that, that actually take it a step further. So Snapchat kind of allows you to play around with, like, funny hats and things like that. And it's, it's entertainment. I get stuck on it sometimes myself just because some of them are very funny. But, on top of that, with the apps, what they also have are the ability for you to take a picture of yourself and doctor up your features. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but if you're not happy with your jawline, you can actually adjust that. If you're not happy with the shape of your ears, you can adjust that. So again, it creates this unrealistic expectation of ourselves that we can't possibly live up to. If I completely doctor my photo at some point, like I said, when I leave the house, people are seeing the true Michael. We are, similar to what I was talking about with Finsta, we are seeing increased incidents of bullying and more extreme bullying activities. A lot of times for many individuals, if we are giving somebody a hard time and they start crying or they start getting upset in front of us, there's like this natural tendency to maybe pull it back a little bit because we're like, oh, that really hurt this person. That really bothered them. It becomes real. But when we're bullying somebody or giving somebody a hard time through a computer screen, we're not necessarily seeing their reaction. If I want to write something really colorful and really hurtful on Instagram and post a message, once I hit post, I'm kind of good to go. I'm done. I don't have to necessarily see what it did to that person when they read that message. So we are seeing more increased incidents of bullying and more extreme bullying activities. The other thing is with bullying, it's kind of 24/7 now. I remember when I was a kid going to school, you were bullied between the hours of 7 and 3, and then you went home and you had like a little bit of a solace in that sense. Whereas now, if you're bullied at school, it resumes when you go home because it kind of follows you just electronically. We are also seeing issues with regards to being desensitized and viewing harmful and or inappropriate content. Things like YouTube, you could really find anything you want on there. And, obviously that's a scary thing when kids are getting access to things like very pornographic material or very violent material. It's interesting. I remember, being a kid, I remember my mom telling me a story, old school movie. I'm not talking about the Brendan Fraser Mummy, but old school. And I remember her telling me the scariest thing, what freaked kids out, was you'd hear the mummy take a step and then you'd hear the foot drag, and you knew, the mummy was coming. You'd hear that stomp and then the drag. And I remember her telling me of this. I was probably like 13, 14 years old when she first told me. And I was like, Mom, that sounds like the most boring movie on earth. Because at that point, I was so used to seeing gore and blood on TV. So, it didn't have the same impact on me that it did for her, because that wasn't common for them when they were younger, having that level of graphicness on the TV. So certainly increased in incidents of being desensitized and viewing harmful material. And information age versus disinformation age. Right now we are becoming a culture where what we see first is what we believe. So anybody could post anything. I could post my beliefs online, and if somebody sees it, they could believe it's the truth. It's not necessarily the truth. So we've kind of lost that ability to kind of research it and do a little bit more digging and just kind of taking things at first glance. Dawn, if you wouldn't mind. So one of the things that's important to kind of keep in the back of your mind is, a lot of times when parents or even clinicians talk about this, a lot of times it's kind of seen as more like a choice. Like, my child is refusing to shut their phone off. They're refusing to shut the video games off. It's more of, imposing their will. They're turning around and saying, this is what I want to do, so I'm going to keep doing it. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. When we talk about the addictive potential of things like phones and video games and things like that, we are finding that it's not unlike somebody who might take a hit of something like ecstasy or cocaine, where it's lighting up that part of your brain and increasing the dopamine because it's activating that area of your brain known as the reward center and pleasure pathway. And as adults and as human beings in general, when we're doing something that gives us pleasure and something that we enjoy, more than likely we are going back to that. And if you think about children, I talk about that in the next slide, I believe, you know, they have a higher tendency of struggling with things like this because they don't have those developed areas of the brain that an adult would to kind of turn around and say, okay, I need to develop some level of a balance. For a child or an adolescent, we keep coming back to it until either it's taken away from us or we can't access it anymore. Dawn, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, Dawn.
Christine
There.
has, oh, there we go. Okay.
Christine took over? Oh, okay, thanks, Dawn. Okay. So one thing I want to touch on, similar to what I was talking about before, is, you know, and obviously there's other areas of the brain, and I know there's medical professionals on this call, I believe, that could certainly speak to this better than I can. But the two areas I wanted to focus on specifically are the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So the reason I'm highlighting this is, again, those areas of our brain that kind of let us know, Michael, this is not a good idea, you should not do this, are not there for a 13, 14, 15-year-old. So when we look at things like the limbic system, which is more that child of our brain, it wants us to feel good, it doesn't like discomfort or pain, that's developing before the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the decision making and the impulse control and stuff like that, which is really, and I like the way they did this graph. They identify the prefrontal cortex as the adult of the brain and the limbic system as the child of the brain. So when the child of the brain is steering the ship, you know, again, we're probably not making the best decisions sometimes because that prefrontal cortex is not there to turn around and say, hold up, Michael, that's not a good idea. And as many of us know, the brain is still developing well into our 20s, usually mid 20s. So, you know, again, 13, 14, 15-year-olds sometimes don't have the tools to kind of keep themselves in check with regards to this. Christine? So real quick, some of the reasons why adolescents are so susceptible to this versus somebody like, you know, 25, 26-year-old. Again, the brain is still developing until around the age of 20. Adolescents, because of that, tend to have the tendency of being impulsive. You know, we don't always think things through. We're kind of living in the moment. We want that instant gratification. And that's becoming a bigger thing. I mean, this is a separate presentation and conversation with those that solely want instant gratification, which keeps us from, you know, going after delayed gratification. Things like putting the hard work in to see the end result is now becoming a thing of the distant past because we want to see results in the immediate now. You know, it's so funny. Usually one of the things I talk about is Guitar Hero. You know, I remember, again, that was coming out when I was a kid, you know, or well, younger, I should say. And I remember thinking, like, you know, you're spending like 5, 6, 7 hours a day playing Guitar Hero. If you picked up an actual guitar, you'd probably be a touring musician at this point. But the thing is, no one wants to sit there and learn scales and learn chords. They want to be able to rock out to a Jimi Hendrix song by hitting 5 buttons on a guitar. So that just kind of goes back to that instant gratification versus delayed gratification mindset. Desire for growth. Oh, can you just go back one more time, Christine? I'm sorry. Desire for a growing social influence and feeling connected. It gives us a platform. You know, it's one of those things where we take it for granted just because we are at the point we are in our lives. We are older, we have our group of friends. And at this point, we're kind of like, well, I like just having 2 friends anyway. I don't want a huge group of friends. But for an adolescent, you want to feel connected. You want to feel as though you have some level of social influence. And the internet and technology acts as a great way to do that because you're kind of weeding out the people that you don't connect with and the people you do versus having to do it the old school way, kind of trying to connect with people in person and make friendships that way, which takes time. It obviously leaves you with some level of disappointment because not everybody is going to want to be your friend. So technology and social media has offered a great opportunity for them to have some level of a social influence and that ability to feel connected. And lastly, like I said, the instant gratification versus the delayed gratification. Christine? Thank you. So with all this, and you could go right to the next one, Christine, with all of this negative stuff that we just kind of spoke about, you know, what kind of keeps us coming back? So besides that biological component, just the, you know, the fact that the brain is not fully developed, things that'll help us, you know, keep ourselves in check, there's more to it also. So having access to anything at your fingertips 24/7 is extremely, extremely inviting for adolescents and children. You know, it's one of those things where the internet never shuts down. So if I want to jump from YouTube to Instagram to Facebook to whatever at 2 o'clock in the morning, I could very easily do that. You know, it's one of those things where it just, the shop never closes in that sense. Christine, if you wouldn't mind. Having connection to others and FOMO. So out of curiosity, I'm always curious to know who's heard of FOMO and who knows what it means. So, okay, so a bunch of hands. Anybody want to blurt it out? Oh, I see a hand raised. I have to go because I'm surrounded by teachers and parents and stuff like that. I have to go with the first person that raised their hand. I think it was Simran.
Hi, that's my daughter's name. It's
Oh.
fear of missing out. I kind of caught on to that last year.
You nailed it. There you go. Well, last year or today, whatever, you still know what it is. So fear of missing out. And you're 100% correct. And it's one of those things where, well, let me ask you this. So what area of our life, something that's huge for our functioning, what area of life would you say probably suffers because of this FOMO? Anybody want to take a guess? Say it again. Oh, I think she said it. I didn't hear her though. Well, I'll pretend you said this just in case you didn't, but I think I heard sleep, which is correct. One of the things that we see with children and adolescents is the sleep patterns are, for lack of a better word, horrific. They're especially this time of year where you're getting up for school, theoretically at 6:30, sometimes even earlier, depending. And, going to bed at like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, because again, we don't want to shut things off. If we're playing video games with people, we don't want our character not to get to that next stage because we signed off before our friends. We don't want to miss out on what's going on in the group chat because we were the ones turning around and saying it's time for me to go to bed. So there's so much incentive not to disconnect in this day and age. And one of the main things that truly does impact is sleep. And of course, well-being in general. I mean, when we're glued to our devices, you can make the argument that that's time when we're not being physically active. We're not, exercising and things like that. So those are other areas of our life that definitely are impacted as well. But definitely sleep is a big one that I say, and I'm sure the same for you all. Christine, if you wouldn't mind. Anonymity and the ability to engage in fantasy. So again, this is one thing, and it's actually very interesting. There's actually studies being done on this about individuals kind of, having a difficult time differentiating from reality versus fantasy, where if you're kind of totally, engaged in role play games and different things like that, creating characters and solely playing this, you start to relate more so with your character in the game than you do in real life, where you almost start to feel a little lost, where you kind of just go through the motions in everyday life because you're so focused on when you can get back to your online gameplay or just your gameplay in general. And the other thing, like I said, and this kind of ties back to Finsta, the ability to kind of be whoever you want. So whether that's creating a false account or creating a real account and just kind of posting false information about your life and how exciting it is, it's extremely, intoxicating for people to kind of be who they truly want to be without truly having to be that person. Christine? And it's socially acceptable. This is one thing, a lot of times for us to change a behavior, usually it's because it's no longer socially acceptable. So, take something as simple as smoking, or that's an over exaggeration, not simple, because it is a complex issue, but something like smoking. Back in the day, you could smoke in a restaurant, you could light up in an airport. Now, if you light up in a restaurant, you're getting about 14 heads looking at you saying, what are you doing? You can't smoke in here. It's no longer socially acceptable. You can smoke outside. And even that's becoming a little bit more of an issue. I know friends of mine that do smoke, they still get looks outside because people don't like it. So it's no longer a socially acceptable behavior. So there might be more incentive to stop that, or at least it's certainly more inconvenient to do it. But if you look at something like phone use and video game use and stuff like that, it's extremely, extremely socially acceptable. So again, a lot of times, and I'm sure at least several of you on this call have heard this from your children, where, okay, if I shut my video games off, all my friends play video games, so what am I supposed to do? If they're all gaming and they're all using their phone, what can I possibly do? So that's become a really difficult conversation to have with youth. Christine? So, and another one, this is actually one that I added over the pandemic because this is now a realistic career path as well. So, you hear a lot about esports and people going into gaming professionally. I actually have a friend of mine, a childhood friend, that is a pro gamer. And, this is becoming one of those things where when we turn around to our children and say, you're playing games too much, they're turning around and saying, well, that's because this is what I want to do when I get older. So this is becoming a realistic career path for individuals as well. Christine? So that's kind of touching on, what about technology and social media and gaming and stuff like that drags our children in. But one of the things that, I've heard from parents over the years is, well, what can we do about it? So I think being able to start having these conversations with our children is essential. And I think to do that, having a plan is key. I think a lot of times what ends up happening is parents will kind of get to that point where they're fed up. I've told him 5 times to shut the video games off. He's not shutting it off. So now I'm going in there, I'm unplugging the video games and I'm taking them away. And that might work for some children, but usually, and I would say the majority of the time that I've spoken to parents that have done that, it usually leads to World War III, where now we're in crisis mode. My child got up, he's screaming, he's cursing, he punched a hole in the wall, because they are so glued to this. And now you're coming in and abruptly taking it away. They don't have the skills to kind of be able to kind of cope with that feeling of disappointment and frustration. So having a plan is key, and not waiting for it to get to crisis mode to implement those limits. So one of the main things that I do encourage parents to do, and clinicians as well, I've done this presentation for clinicians as well, is beginning to explore the why your child is spending so much time on social media or video games. What are they getting from that they're not getting in their everyday life? Because it's very oversimplified to turn around and say, well, this is a behavioral thing. He just doesn't listen. He keeps playing video games, or she keeps using social media, all those different things. It's very easy to kind of turn around and say that's the issue. They're just not listening. But I think in my experience, I see it being deeper than that. It's generally individuals that are getting something from those behaviors that they're not getting in other areas of their life. And I think by engaging in conversations that way, trying to explore what they're getting from this, comes across as less punitive and less authoritative, in a sense, where you're trying to come from a place of understanding versus a place of imposing your will. And one podcast that I listened to, it's a gentleman, and some of you might be familiar with him. He's a pretty well-known psychologist, Dr. Ross Green. He's been on different podcasts and different news channels and stuff like that. He kind of touches on different ways we as parents kind of discipline or try and get a child to kind of fall into some of the behaviors we want to see. And one of the things he talks about is kind of plan A being imposing your will. And one of the things that he says that really resonates with me is engaging in plan A with a child creates challenging behaviors in a challenging child. So somebody who might struggle with ADHD or just is a typical adolescent doesn't have the skills, understandably, their brain is still developing, doesn't have the same skills that a 25, 26-year-old would have if you were imposing your will on them. If you imposed your will on me, I'm most likely not going to pick up my computer and throw it. I might not like what you're saying, but I'm going to kind of be like, all right, it is what it is. I'll deal with this later type of a thing. Whereas a child, if you try and impose your will, it creates challenging behavior. So they naturally want to kind of push back. And I think that's why usually that plan A, imposing your will, is typically not a great way to go about it, because it probably only works for a very small percentage of children. So that leads to his other thing, which is collaborative problem solving. So engaging in collaborative problem solving by allowing the adolescent to be a part of the discussion. Again, this leads to them feeling like as though they are a part. It's not you telling them what they're going to do. It's more getting some level of buy-in, because ultimately the goal is getting them to be a little bit more autonomous and able to make these decisions themselves. It's unrealistic to kind of expect them to be abstinent from devices, even if they're using it a lot. I think the word of the day that I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this is balance, being able to develop more balance. So if we're spending time on video games for 10 hours a day, maybe we're pulling that back to 5, which is still, a lot, we could say, but maybe we're pulling that back to 5 and engaging in something else more productive or at least different for the other 5 hours a day. So developing some level of a balance and getting their buy-in with that. So again, it's that instilling our will versus collaborative problem solving mentality, and having a clear and consistent expectation as far as tech use. So if your goal as a parent, okay, is to get them to spend less time on the video games or less times on the phone, having a little bit of a plan as far as how long or how much time you think is fair, and also what needs to be done before using it. So I've heard people describe gaming or phone use as kind of the dessert to the dinner, meaning maybe you're doing your homework first and then you get the remainder of the night to play games or whatever. The other thing that's kind of cool, and it kind of leads into the next bullet, is allowing the adolescent to have some choice. So again, as a parent, if you feel like 2 hours of time on a game or 2 hours of time on your device is adequate, allowing them to use the 2 hours whenever. So you might come from a place where you want to see homework done before that happens, and that's totally fine. But if you're getting some pushback, maybe turning around and saying, you know what, fine, you want to come home and play video games right away, that's cool. You got 2 hours of time to do it. You can use that 2 hours wherever you want, plug it in wherever you want, as long as your other stuff is getting done. And again, remember to be empathetic and refocusing on the why. Christine? The do's and don'ts. I do want to touch on this real quick. So do encourage your child to be involved in other things. One of the things that I find usually sets a child up for failure, and this could be related to individuals struggling with substance use as well. When we found something that is our coping skill and gives us a release, we're always going back to it until something else takes that place. Until we fill the void with something else, we are going back to what we know best and what we know works. So again, if we're turning around and saying no more phone, no more video games, but we're not giving them or encouraging them to do something else in that absence, usually you're going to be met with arguments because they're turning around and saying, I'm bored. And usually a child or an adolescent that's bored is usually your worst nightmare because they're hounding you. They want what they want. So again, encouraging your child to be involved in different things. And schools, Dawn, Christine, you guys are awesome with stuff like this. Schools offer a lot of different opportunities, local opportunities in the community. Libraries offer really great things. It's important to help them find their posse, whether that's joining a club, whether that's joining a sport, whatever, helping them find something that's going to give them that void to fill. Encourage a wind down time at night. So again, one of the big things is, adolescents or children will kind of turn around and say, well, music puts me to sleep, watching YouTube puts me to sleep. So I use it until 11 o'clock. And what they don't realize is the light from the phone and what they're watching usually results in them being overly stimulated. So they feel like it's putting them to sleep. But really what it is there's kind of this time lapse where they think they're getting tired, but they're getting tired because their brain is getting to the point where it wants to shut down because they've been doing it for the past 3-4 hours. So it's not so much that it's helping them sleep. It's just getting them to that point where the brain is like, enough, we got to go to sleep. So encourage a wind down time. So maybe, and of course this isn't for me to say, but maybe your time is 9 o'clock. We're shutting everything down at 9 o'clock. You can come downstairs, have a snack or something. You take a shower, take a bath, whatever you want to do to kind of start winding down in that sense. And what's important to understand is generally when you're dealing with behavioral type stuff, the behavior will get worse before it gets better. So when you start trying to do this, they're going to push back. Very, very rarely does somebody just fall in line and say, okay, not a problem, 9 o'clock, I'll hand my device over. Usually it's, well, that's ridiculous. I never had to do this before. Why are you doing this to me? So just in the back of your mind, understand that generally the behavior will get worse before it gets better. And then all of a sudden they start slipping into a little bit of a pattern and a routine where it starts becoming a little bit easier as time goes on. And sometimes, to be honest, sometimes that's still a struggle. There might be months that go by and a few months, more than a few months that go by, and it's still a real struggle to get them to hand the stuff over. And that's when, individuals like myself or other clinicians or school people might be able to help develop a little bit of balance with you as well by kind of continuing to share that message with the child. A lot of times when we're hearing a message from mom, dad, or whoever our caregiver is, it's usually in one ear out the other because we don't want to be bothered with mom and dad. Mom and dad know nothing. But if we start hearing from, our therapist or a close friend, whatever it might be, we start retaining it a little bit more because now it's not just coming from mom and dad, it's coming from somebody else that feels this way as well. So maybe it is an issue. Technology curfew. I was listening to a podcast a few months ago, and I thought one of the things that this individual said that was really cool was that, I wouldn't let my child wander around a questionable neighborhood at 2 o'clock in the morning. So why am I letting them have access to anything they want at 2 o'clock in the morning on their device? So that put it into perspective for me. We feel like sometimes having a phone is a right when in reality it's a privilege. You get the phone during the day. There's some children that don't even get a phone, to be honest with you. So once we get to that point where enough is enough, there should be some level of a technology curfew, just because, again, if they want to kind of access anything they want, they have the ability to do it without really any supervision per se. Utilize opportunities for teachable moments. Again, like I said, just turning around and telling them that you don't want them to do it is going to be met with resistance. They're not going to fully get why it is. They're going to think you're overreacting, being difficult. But, doing things like utilizing teachable moments allows things to kind of hopefully hit home a little bit more. So, for example, unfortunately, I've heard all too many times that sometimes people will post things that they didn't mean in the moment, but it's already out there, and then they're dealing with the repercussions of it. Or pictures, little racy pictures that are being sent. Now they regret it, and it's already out there. And the problem with technology is once you send me something, I'm blasting it out to 10 of my friends, and it just continues to circulate. So you hear, unfortunately, too many horror stories about these types of things. So using one of these as an opportunity to say, look, this is not me over exaggerating. This is stuff that's actually happening out there. I'm worried about you. I want to keep you safe. I don't want you making these types of mistakes, and allowing them to hopefully see it for themselves that, this is not just mom and dad overreacting. Again, going back to the why, try and put yourself in your child's shoes and be empathetic and model the behaviors you want to see. There's one thing called phubbing. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. Just out of curiosity, by a show of hands, has anybody heard of phubbing? Okay, so phubbing is basically snubbing somebody with your phone. So if you're sitting at a dinner table and you're boring me with a conversation, I'm picking up my phone and scrolling through my phone, and what they're seeing is this is actually having horrible effects, and not to get, Debbie Downerish, but, this is having horrible effects on youth because parents are doing it to their children. So children are sitting at the dinner table, or maybe you have babies kind of sitting there and parents are scrolling through their phone just aimlessly and sometimes not even realizing it. And the way children perceive that is, I'm not entertaining my parent, I'm not enough for their attention. And what they're finding is this phubbing phenomenon is having impacts on youth that are growing up. And this is infant age up to adolescence. So modeling the behaviors you want to see. If your expectation is we're not using phones at the dinner table, then as the adult, and this is where we get into an issue, because a lot of times parents I talk to, they're kind of like, well, they're the kid, I'm the adult. If I say they're not using their phone, they're not using their phone, but I'm the adult. I get to make my own decisions. And yeah, to a degree, that's right. You are the adult. But at the same time, kids kind of have more black and white thinking in that regard. So if you're telling them no phones at the dinner table and you're using that, they're using that in their next argument. They're turning around and saying, yeah, you're telling me no phones at the dinner table, but dad used it the other day. So modeling the behaviors you want to see. As far as the don'ts, again, don't just take the video games away without a plan. It's going to lead to World War III. Don't set unrealistic goals or expectations. So again, if somebody's playing video games for 10 hours a day, yeah, we can all sit here and agree that is way too much. We got to pull that back. But at the same time, going from 10 hours a day to 0, again, is going to set you up for failure. It's almost like, and again, I know there's some medical professionals on here as well. So again, they could certainly speak to it better than I can, but there's ways to kind of take somebody off medication by titrating medication, going down from 10 milligrams to 5 milligrams to 0. That allows somebody to come off something a little bit more safely. And when we're talking about behavioral interventions, things like reducing gameplay or reducing screen time, having that titrating mentality is a good way to go about it. Because if we go from all to nothing too quick, it's just too much for them to adjust to. So breaking it down one step at a time. Don't assume your child will be able to set their own limits and self-monitor. Again, the brain is not fully formed to be able to kind of have that checks and balances skill as of yet. And don't assume they have no access to technology when you take away a phone or video game. So one thing I've heard from parents I've worked with, and it's not just one family, I've heard this from multiple, is when you get your child or get your loved one a different phone, so you're upgrading to the iPhone, whatever they're at now, iPhone 4000, what happens is when you get rid of the old device, you can still link if you have Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi access and stuff like that. So you might not necessarily be able to make calls, but you do have the ability to sign on to things with Wi-Fi access. So keep in the back of your mind, if you do happen to take away some technology or take a phone away, be mindful of what else is in the house. And again, where there's a will, there's a way. Children a lot of times are much more savvy than we are as far as different ways to get around firewalls and different things like that. So just again, keep in the back of your mind that, there is always some level of access. So being mindful of that in the home, and don't assume this is going to change overnight. It's one of those things where, like I said before, behavioral stuff, anytime there's some level of behavioral modification, it takes time, and generally, unfortunately, it gets worse before it gets better. Christine? Not all tech use is necessarily a problem. So you can skip to the next one, Christine. And I think a lot of this I already kind of touched on. Again, one thing that I like to touch on is similar to what I said before. And I think that's my final slide after this, actually, it kind of reiterates that the amount of time we're spending is not necessarily the issue. It's what we're taking in. And a lot of times also, other areas of our life. So not all tech use is necessarily an issue. If you have a child that's going to school, rocking it academically, going to sports after school, doing a terrific job with that, or going to theater, whatever it might be, and then coming home and wanting to game for the rest of the night, as a parent, you might turn around and say, you know what? That's okay. My son or daughter is excelling in all other areas of their life. If they want to kind of come home and kind of stretch out and relax and play games for the rest of the night, cool. That's not an issue. So the things that you want to start watching out for are things like worsening hygiene, refusing to come out of your room, refusing to attend school, other areas of their life that are starting to suffer because they're so focused on tech or so focused on gaming. Decreased interest in offline activities. This is, like I said before, with regards to that fantasy and role play type stuff. When individuals start seeing true real life as an inconvenience because it's taking them away from what they really want to be doing. So again, looking at things like decreased interest in offline activities, increased irritability when asked to disconnect or shut down a device. And some of this is normal. Generally, if you ask an adolescent or a child to do something they don't want to do, they're typically going to push back. I mean, very rarely do they turn around and say, okay, not a problem, I'm shutting it down. So there is going to be some level of irritability when it comes to that. However, there's different levels of severity. You know, if their way of dealing with that is turning around and saying, fine, I'll shut it off. All right, a little attitude is to be expected. But if they turn around and pick up the computer and throw it against the wall, that's a different level of severity. Continued use despite negative consequences at home, school, work, and or relationships. Again, this is something that trickles into adulthood as well. I read a really terrific book about a year ago on what's it called? Cyber psychology. I forget the individual that wrote it, but she's terrific, based out of I think Ireland. And she gave different case studies and different examples of, unfortunately, infants and children passing away because their caregiver, their parent, was so focused on the game, so focused on the phone, where they were, you know, disregarding cries and things like that. So this is something that obviously shows that there's a significant issue going on, where you can't break away because you're so distracted and so focused on what's going on. So this is one of those things where it truly is an issue. And there's unfortunately multiple case studies of that, not just one instance. And also being able to watch out for preoccupation with online experiences, even when offline. So you'll actually see, this is especially for individuals that do things like write code and stuff like that. You'll sometimes see their hands and they'll type on their desk when they don't have a keyboard in front of them. It's that muscle memory and they're thinking about it. So you'll sometimes see them type their fingers when there's no keyboard around. So that's another thing where you're kind of turning around and saying, you know, how much is too much in that sense. Christine, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, so that actually brings me, and just click one more time. I think the next one is references, Christine. Yeah, so if you can just go back, Christine, just leave it on that slide. Yeah, perfect. So the no screen time is created equal. Different uses will lead to different effects. And again, this goes back to what we're taking in. If it's solely gaming, if it's solely pornographic material, this is going to impact our behaviors differently than maybe somebody who's has a little bit more of a balanced structure as far as what they're taking in during the day. So 5 hours of tech use is not, you know, the same for everybody, because it depends on what they're using in that 5 hours of time. So without further ado, I wanted to kind of open it up at the end. If there's any questions that anybody has, if there's any, you know, just personal experiences that you've had, or just questions that you have in general, anything that I went over that wasn't really super clear that you want me to kind of reiterate, I'm kind of, you know, here to answer anything that you might have. Or if you just want to kind of share, you know, your own experiences, that's totally fine too. You don't need to have a question necessarily, but I'm happy to kind of open it up.